Hello everyone, welcome to VizConnect, connecting you with the art of data visualization and storytelling. My name is Sagar Kapoor, part of customer success team at Tableau. We are into the season 4 of VizConnect. Thanks a lot for all your support and help. I think it has been a great journey. And thank you for all the presenters, Tableau champions, Tableau Zen masters, for coming and sharing your knowledge and best practices with everyone in the community. So all the VizConnect sessions are uploaded to our YouTube channel. Go ahead, subscribe to it. Some great content is waiting for you. We have a LinkedIn group. Go ahead, connect with each other, learn from each other, and get updated with all the latest on VizConnect. With that, let me also talk about IronViz. So IronViz, I think, again, you can go ahead and participate. The global qualifiers is open till 7th of Feb. Go ahead and participate in IronViz. It will help you a lot in terms of improving your data visualization and storytelling skills, and lots of great prizes to be won. So yeah, go ahead and do participate in IronViz. With that, let me go ahead and welcome our speaker for today. His name is Zak Geis. Zak is a leader of Tableau COE at JP Morgan Chase, an experienced leader in data analytics and visualization with a focus on enabling insight through best practices. Within Chase COE, he leads a small team of experts who share a goal of using their talents and experience in BI to build on and learn from the power of data. He is also the member of Tableau Data Dev Ambassador Program, and he is the co-lead of the Viz Office Hours initiative and blogs on his site. You can go ahead and reach out to him on his Twitter profile. Without further ado, now I will hand it over to Zak to deep dive into Tableau performance. Zak, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sagar. Really excited to be here. Really excited. I think this is my third time on VizConnect. So, love jumping over here and talking through things. Today's a topic that is, I'd say, close to my heart. I really like Tableau Performance. I really like digging into the weeds here. If you're joining, I assume that the same can be said about you, and that you are nerdy enough to be here to listen to me talk about performance on Tableau. So I appreciate everybody joining. Actually, let me change that. I shared the wrong thing. I'm going to share this screen right here, and we're going to go ahead and get going. So, all right. Sagar did a really great job introducing me. There's not much that I would add. You can find me on Twitter and even my email right there. I'm very open to always chatting with new folks. I'm always interested in just having a conversation. So if you want to reach out, if you have questions, if I don't go through something you want an answer to, feel free to reach out here. I'm a member of a lot of different things here with the Tableau community. They're all listed there, and Sagar mentioned those. You can also find me on Tableau Public. That's outside of performance and Tableau Server and data dev. I also actually like to do design work, so you can find a lot of that on Tableau Public. So let's start off. Our topic today is talking about performance. So it's always good to have a frame of reference before we go too deep into the topic. Depending on who you talk to, depending on what you're working with and what the type of, I guess, turn off my virtual background because my CPU usage is high. Apparently that's too much for my computer. Talk about performance. All right. So depending on what you're doing, if it's a quick analytic, if it's a dashboard, if it's a big gathering of data with crosstabs and filters, you're going to probably have different expectations when it comes to how fast it performs. I did a little bit of research ahead of this topic, and I found a couple things that I thought were interesting for this presentation. So this is research from Google, and this is about bounce rates. So bounce rates are really, something you don't want in website design, which is somebody comes to your page and they only come to one page. They go away immediately. They, they don't return. They just go to the one page, and that is something you don't want. Obviously, if somebody's coming to your page, you want them to continue to drill through and go to different pages, stay on the site. And research from Google found that the longer a page took, from 1 to 3 to 1 to 5 to 6 seconds to 10 seconds, the much larger your bounce rate becomes. It shows that people, I think, over time are getting more expectant of performance. They're expecting you to be very quick. They're expecting the results to come right to them, or they're going to get distracted and they're going to move away. So obviously this is about websites, but I still think that that pattern applies to dashboards, to Tableau. You should think about your users and how many different things that they have. They have to go through their emails and maybe their instant messages and phone calls, text, Facebook, all the other work things that they have to do. If your dashboard takes too much time, they're going to bounce away. They're going to spend time on other things, and maybe not, they'll come back to your site. So something to consider. I put my own thought into, based on my experience, what I feel are kind of the thresholds that you should focus on. Now, again, these are things that could be dependent on what kind of use case you have, what kind of users you have. There's so many different criteria to what should be good. But I think in general, this is a pretty good thing to balance against. If you're getting them data in under 5 seconds, which surely is possible, they're going to be excited. They're going to be overjoyed. They're going to be Mr. Smiles over here. You're going to see their teeth. They're real happy. You get between 5 and 10 seconds, they're fine. They're doing okay. It's probably not ideal, but they're still pretty content with it. You start to get over 10 seconds, they're probably going to start to lose attention. They're not going to be too happy. And especially if you get over 15 seconds, you're going to have people very unhappy with the performance. They might shed a tear or two, depending on how engaged they are, but they're not probably all that happy. So something to consider. Again, it could be different for your use case, but I think as a general standard, I think that this does apply to most content that you can see in data visualization. So that said, let's talk about first how to get that performance. There are a variety of different tools that we can use to gather information about what's happening in Tableau and see what the performance is, what parts of the data loading and the visualization loading take the most time. So the first one is desktop recording. So performance recording on the desktop. And for this, I'm going to switch over to Tableau Desktop because I think it's really important that you know how to do this. This is one of the most important things in trying to do better when it comes to the performance of your workbook. So when I'm in Tableau, and this is one thing that I will say that's very important. This is something that's often missed in people, even that do know how to use the performance recorder. Always, always, always start the performance recording before you open your workbook. Don't do it afterwards because then you actually miss the initial load of the workbook when you go to review those results. So to open the performance recording, I'm going to go to the Help menu, Settings and Performance, Start Performance Recording. Now, nothing's going to happen, but the performance recording application is running in the background. It is checking things. So now that I have turned that on, I can go to a dashboard. I'll just go to an example that I have here on my desktop. It is early my time, so if you see me drinking a Monster, it's just for the energy. So I'm on my dashboard. This is now, since I have, since I have turned on the performance recording, this is where I want to click around. I want to do the things that my user is going to do. So click through the different charts, click through the dashboards, interact with things, change filters, all the things that they could and might do. I'm going to spend time in doing those just so that I gather a good set of results to review when I get to looking at my performance recording. So again, just clicking through, doing the different things. I've got a lot of random little stuff going on here inside of this dashboard, clicking through, just trying stuff out. All right, so I'm good. Usually I'd spend more time, I'd go through those things, and I'll explain why in a moment, but I usually, when I go through this, will actually write it down. I'll write down the steps so that I know exactly what I did. So open the dashboard. Then I changed this filter. Then I went to this tab and then I changed this filter. And then I interacted with this graph. It's going to come into play in the next step. So I'm good with things. I'll go up here back to the help menu. I'll go back up to settings and performance. And you'll see that this now says stop performance recording. And I'll hit that. You'll see Tableau think for a second. And what it's doing is it's compiling those results and it's going to put those into a separate Tableau workbook for me to then review. This is really the one of the best things that you can do to review your performance. So once this is open, we'll give it just a moment. There we go. So I've got this new workbook now. This is my performance recording file. This is something that I can now save. I can use this how I want. I can play around with the settings. It's very useful for getting a sense of what's taking the longest time. So there's three main sections to this workbook, this dashboard. The top is basically a Gantt chart representing from beginning to end the things that happened along the process. So we open the workbook. That was uncompressing the workbook. And if we go in here, you'll see more. We parsed the XML. Every workbook is just XML. And then I computed all these layouts and see all the different worksheets that were computed. And you can see all the different, on this tab, which ones are computed. Not a lot of things that I would care about. What I'm looking for is really big bars. Now, here's one. This one took, a little bit of time here. This is something that I might want to look at. Now, I know personally maps take a little bit more time than most charts, so it's not too bad. But this is what I'm looking for, large, long bars. The second thing on this chart, this worksheet, is the list of things that happened in descending order. So this is another way to look at it. I can see the same kind of stuff. I can look at the top one that represents that bigger bar that we've seen. This is where I might want to focus on it. You'll see all the different events that happened. There was blending that happened. There was compiling. There was rendering. Really good, useful information to figure out where the time is spent. And if you look at things specifically that are like a query related thing, you'll actually see the query itself. Now, this is most useful when you're in a live connection because it's actually going to show you that the live SQL is generated against the source. It's not so useful in this case because I'm connected to an extract of an Excel. It's going to kind of be looking at things more in kind of the VizQL route, which is less meaningful. It's harder for me to clean things up, but you will still be able to get a sense for how it's building that connection to the extract. Excuse me. So let's go back over here to our performance toolbox. So we did desktop recording. The second thing is server recording. So this is another thing that even if you knew that you could do desktop, some people don't know that you can do the server side as well. So it's kind of good. This one, put just this over here. So I'm watching the chat in case there's anything. If you have questions, I'm happy to kind of stop for a second. Otherwise, I will give time at the end. I didn't mention that. So server performance recording, this is pretty much the same thing. And this is very important because oftentimes you'll see that something runs as you would expect on desktop and you put it on the server and then it starts to become slower. So it's good to get the same kind of information from the server where all you need to do is add record underscore performance equals yes to the end of your URL. Now, I will caveat that with it needs to be turned on for your site in the Tableau server, but as long as that's true, you can always add this little bit. And what that does is it adds this performance icon onto the toolbar for your dashboard. And the way that this works is you would just interact with your dashboard. This is where those notes come into play because I want to look at things apples to apples from desktop to server. And so when I go from the desktop to the server, I'm going to go through the same list. So, okay, when I was on desktop, I opened the workbook, done. I changed this filter, I switched this tab, I changed this filter. just so I can look at things the exact same way and look at the list and look at how that kind of Gantt chart flows and which ones are big. So I can evaluate, okay, is server adding a bunch of new things that are slowing things down? Now, there's a lot of things you can do on the server to increase performance, whether that be scaling up, scaling out, adding more processes. There's a lot of things that you can do on the server to just work the best with it when it comes to performance. The third thing that is just a treasure trove of information is the Postgres repository. This is behind every Tableau instance. So there are built-in views. This is an example of a built-in view that you can go to from the status screen that shows you over time the performance. The first two things that I mentioned were useful in looking at things kind of one at a time. I go into one dashboard, I see what it looks like. This is better for looking at trends, looking at it across users, looking for the distribution of loads. Okay, do certain people get slower performance? Does it happen at a certain time of the day? Things like that is very useful. And outside of that, outside of what's built in, you can also build your own. This is an example. I've overlaid a white box so some of the more sensitive things aren't shown. But this is a custom report that I built where you can look at the performance based on Postgres. This refreshes every day. It also stacks the data. So the one that was built into Tableau Server only has 7 days of history. If you build an incremental extract, you can continue to get that data and actually look at things like this. And the value here is, you can customize it. So this is median performance over day compared to how many views, compared to how many users, a breakdown in the distribution of like what is the really slow stuff that's up here, what's the slightly slower, so that I want to get to a point where most things are happening under 5 seconds, like we talked about. So there's a whole range of things that you can build when it comes to, the data itself and custom charts. The final thing I'll mention is the resource monitoring tool. Now, this is a paid add-on for Tableau. It comes under the server management add-on, but there's a lot inside of this application that relates back to performance. So the main screen, which is here in the background, shows you the things that you would typically care about at a server level. Are the processors keeping up? Is CPU, staying under 100%? Is the memory filling up? Or do we have a lot of disk queuing happening? How's the network look like? Things like that. But there's other things that are built in, like slow view load request and load times. And it's pretty intelligent how it's built. It actually will establish baselines. You can kind of see the color coding here. It'll establish a baseline based on history. So let's just take an example of dashboard. We'll call it dashboard 1. Dashboard 1 is used by a lot of people, and over time we gather results. And over the last 30 days, let's say it averages about 10 seconds of performance. The resource monitoring tool is going to pick that up. It's going to say, okay, this dashboard is 10 seconds. And it's going to alert you if it starts to get beyond that. So if it's greater than baseline times 2, it's going to stack up to yellow. If it's greater than 4, it's going to go to red. And it's going to start to actually learn about your content and alert you based on that. And so if you see a lot of red and a lot of yellow at the same time, you know something's going on with the server. So it's something that I definitely want to mention that. There's a lot of there's a lot of there's a lot of other sources, other things that I would mention. These are the 4 I wanted to focus on. The other things that come to get to mind are logs. So all of this data is available in the logs as well. You can go through and see, what's the performance, what exactly is happening. You can throw this into log viewers or log chart to see more accurate performance and more detailed, nuanced performance information. There's Tabmon, which actually looks at more of the machine level information. There's just a lot of different various things that I would say, look out there and see what's available. These are the 4 that I say are kind of the most important. Okay, before I move on, there's a couple questions. So how to access check the Postgres tool. So the 2 things that I mentioned here, there are the built-in screens. So the built-in screens are available to any site admin or server admin on Tableau Server. If you go to the site status, you can see that there's a list of different dashboards that are built for you. So you can see usage, background or activity, and performance. So I think it's called loads to views, something like that. So that's available. As far as getting the data itself, it's a little bit more involved, but all you have to do is from a server admin console, from TSM, activate the read-only account so that you can actually connect to the database. And then the user that wants to connect needs to know that credential and then connect to it. It's just a Postgres instance that sits behind Tableau Server. You know, if it's a single node, it's the same server URL. If it's multi-node, it depends where your repository sits, but it's all available for connecting. The other question, I set Tableau Desktop connection to source it live. While publishing, it still asks me, you're about to publish 455 megabytes of external data. Do you want to continue? Um, it depends. It's something that I need to look at, but it sounds like maybe this could be like you might be connecting to like a second data source. You could even have images, things like that. Those are considered additional data that you publish up, especially when you publish. There's a checkbox that says include external files. If you include those external files, any kind of things that is connected to locally will be batched up and start as part of that deployment. And yes, this is being recorded. All the VizConnect sessions are recorded and all hosted. So you'll be able to find that afterwards. All right, so ways to improve performance. So let's talk about that. So the first thing that I would say when it comes to improving performance, and this is always the first thing that I ask, the first thing that I mention, the first thing I recommend, is you want to trim it. So we can go through the whole gambit, and we will. We're going to talk about a lot of options here. But the very first thing that you should always look for is, are there opportunities to slim things down? I'll give an example. There's a dashboard that I worked on recently that we got it to, a pretty reasonable performance expectation, something like 13, 15 seconds, something like that. But it was still not as fast as I was expecting. So I worked with a team and we found that there were a lot of columns that were not used in the main page. They were used in supplemental detail pages. So these couple hundred columns were actually impacting it drastically. So trimming it down, especially the width, made a substantial difference. It took off another 5 seconds. So definitely look for opportunities. If there are columns that you're not using, take those out. If there are rows that you're not using, take those out. If there's an opportunity to aggregate. I found many, many times that if you really look at this and you look as hard as you can at trimming things down, sometimes you can get to a fraction, a very small fraction of the overall size. I think of it as a big square or maybe like a big Excel sheet. And we're taking off columns, we're taking off rows, and you get to a point where you're maybe 10 cells as opposed to 300 cells. If you spend a lot of time focusing on that, I guarantee it's going to be faster, but you got to think about all the load that's going back and forth. Now, that said, there's other things that you can focus on. So some things, and a lot of these do apply more so with live connections than extracts, but they are still useful to think about even in extract fashion. Do use native joins and don't use custom SQL. Now, I will also say there's a caveat, everything that I mentioned here, sometimes you just don't have a choice. Sometimes you got to use SQL. But I will tell you, Tableau, when you do things in the native way, you do the things that Tableau is expecting, it's actually going to be smarter. It's going to do its best, and it's going to do better with doing things quickly. So when you use native joins, Tableau is going to think about how it sends that query back to the database, especially in live connections. It's going to be more tuned down. It's going to be smaller and slimmer as a statement. When you use custom SQL, Tableau has a tendency to have that as your inner SQL, and you're going to do SQL on top of it, especially in like I said, a live connection. So if you have a dashboard that's live and you connect to the data, and then you go over here and you change a filter, and then you click over here, Tableau is actually going to take that turn it into an inner query, an inside query, and then that's going to be wrapped in another query that's going to do the work on top of that. And Tableau is going to kind of get into this chain of making things more and more complex. So definitely something to think about, consider. do use visuals and don't use tabular data as much as possible. So Tableau is a visual tool. It has a visual engine. It is very fast at putting together a bar chart, a line chart, and the different charts that you see. It's not so fast when it comes to tabs or tabular data and record level information and a bunch of filters. The way that Tableau works on the browser is it packages everything into little images. So when I look at this line chart, for example, what happens is it packs together some objects and some images for the line. It packs it together for the axis, for the title up here, for the different dots. It's going to throw together, so not for the different dots, for the one thing right here. It's going to throw together a little slim package of images to compile on your browser and put together what you see. When you do this over here with all of this, it's going to do the same thing. And if you think about it, every one of these cells is a new thing that it actually has to render on your browser. So I've seen many examples where you have, a million records and you have 20 columns and you're putting that on the browser. And people ask, why is that slow? Well, that's a lot of things that Tableau is doing just to give you that view. And I see the point is it is a struggle. People, sometimes our customers and our users don't agree with this. Now, what I usually recommend here, if you are trying to get people to use more visual things, without getting too far off on that subject, is try to introduce little bits at a time. So keep that cross tab, but maybe throw some bars at the top that you use to filter to go down. Alternatively, put a main menu, and that's where they go, and give them two options. Say, here's the visual, here's the table. And a lot of times I'll notice people actually, when they start checking out that visual, they're going to see, oh, they're doing some cool stuff over there. I might use that a little bit. And you start to, trick them into thinking it's their idea that they want to use it. So just something to think about. Do use a fixed dashboard size and don't use dynamic. So this comes to caching. Tableau does not cache, at least in the visual layer, anything when it's dynamic range because everybody's going to have a different dynamic, view of their dashboard. When it's fixed, it is going to cache across people's usage. So always do that. It's also just general, I think, from a design practice, a better route because you know exactly what things are going to look like when you do publish them. Okay. Do use native drivers. Don't use generic ODBC. Native drivers, Tableau puts a lot of work into these. They put into them a lot of best practices. They use the databases, better in a lot of ways. It's faster typically. Lots of good things about the native drivers. The generic ODBC option, it works. It gets the job done, but it's not smart. It's not going to do any extra work to do things more quickly, more favorably for that database. It's just going to get the job done. Now, I was going to continue going through this list of do's and don'ts, but I found that there weren't nearly as many do's, so I put this tab together. There's a lot of don'ts. So let's go through these. Don't use older Tableau versions. Tableau, every single release puts in new things to get faster and better at Tableau. There's always going to be little things that do a little bit better, so always do your best to be on the latest version of Tableau. Don't do user filtering. Now, user filtering is sometimes required, just like a lot of things, but user filtering does not cache. Every single user that goes to the dashboard is going to get a different set of data, and so it's not going to cache between the users. It's not going to save that in memory. It's going to actually take a lot of time, every single user to render the dashboard. Don't use a ton of marks on the dashboard. The more that you get, when you get into thousands of marks, it's going to get slower. It's going to start rendering a little bit, worse, especially in the browser. Don't nest a bunch of if calculations. Tableau actually goes through and evaluates every answer in the if and else, even if there's nothing that applies into them. Use case statements instead. Don't cache your field types in Tableau. So take the time before it even gets to Tableau to turn, let's say, an integer into string, if it makes sense, or something into Boolean. Like, it depends, whatever it is, but don't do that in Tableau. It's going to take more time. Don't publish your data sources separately. Now, this one's maybe controversial for some people, but I will say that 99% of the time, if a data source is embedded inside of your workbook, it is going to be significantly faster. I won't even say a little bit. It's going to be a decent a bit faster, just because you got to think about this. Tableau does, it's all contained. It's all in the workbook. It doesn't have to go back with network chattiness between this and another node that's holding the data source. It's all contained, so it's going to be faster. Use blending, sparingly. It is not something you should use a lot. Blending can slow things down, especially if you blow at lower grains. If you do get a blend, make sure it's at the higher aggregated level. Try not to use relevant values only on filters. That's gonna take some load, especially on a live connection. It's just gonna take some time to think about, okay, based on this other filter, I should only show these. Don't use calculations for bins, sets, groups, aliases. This is another example of Tableau knows what it's doing. Use the built-in options to create groups and sets and aliases off of the right-click menu context filter menu options. Try not to use count D too much. There's certain calculations, this window functions, the percentile functions. Some of those can be slow. Some of those can be, take a decent amount of resources. Try not to use server-side rendering. So this is more of a server setting or something you can do in the URL, but the more that you push to the local client's browser, so client rendering, a lot of times that's going to go a little bit faster because the clients oftentimes have the performance on their workstations to load that. Otherwise, everything is being done by the server or even rendering in the browser. Try not to use polygon mark types. They're just not going to run and render nearly as fast as something like a bar chart or a line chart. It looks like I put these twice, so we'll just emphasize it. Don't use cross data source filters if you can avoid it. Cross data source filters actually constitute as a blend. So if you have something that applies, even let's just say I go and I pick the apply to all related data sources in a filter. And let's just say it's not even really being used on there. It actually still going to constitute as a blend. It's something I recently learned. It takes the time. It's going to count as blend. It's going to slow things down. So try to not filter across multiple data sources. Another question, how does the number of sheets dashboards impact the performance of a workbook? You definitely want to keep things just like what I said earlier about trimming things. You do want to trim as much as you can when it comes to the workbook. If you have a lot of tabs and a lot of sheets, it's going to continue to slow things down. It's more work. It's going to be doing a lot of things like that. What I often do, especially if I get very complex in a workbook or a set of dashboards, is I'll trim those into different workbooks, and I'll put maybe like a wrapper on top. And so I'll have like a wrapper that goes and gives you the navigation. You can pick this tab or this tab, and that goes to different URLs, which are embedded workbooks. That saves you some time so that you have only one workbook in its associated data source and its data loading at one time. You're flipping to the other one. That's going to be a separate load. It's going to be separate data. So that's one way. It's a good thing to try and think about how you can club things out. There's other efficiencies to that as well. Like I like that because it allows a team of people to work on something rather than just one person working on one mega dashboard. Having it cut into different workbooks allows different people to work on it. Hiding unused fields features the same as trimming it out. Yeah. So as long as you hide those unused fields, when you generate that extract, it's going to take those out of the extract and it won't be included there. Some generally useful information. So another question before we move on. Can you please talk a little bit more about server-side rendering? Yeah, so when you render a dashboard, depending on the settings of your server, usually it's set to kind of like a mixed mode. It's going to either run and render your dashboard through the server or through the client, which is the local browser. Now, if things are set to server-side rendering, the server is going to own the entire flow. Not only is the server going to generate the data and all those images and everything, it's going to do the work to stitch it together and basically tie a bow around it. It's going to do the whole thing. When it is done on the client side, server's still going to do a lot. It's still going to get the data. It's going to pass it over. But your client browser and thus your local machine is going to do the work to actually stitch it together and put it together on the fly. This is beneficial because if you take some of the work off the server, you're leaving resources for it to do it for other things. And oftentimes, just because of what's happening on other places of the server, client's going to be a little bit faster because your local browser or your local client, your local machine is not probably doing nearly as much as that server is. You can actually change this. So two ways. You can change this on the server and make it just force it to be server, force it to be client. That's one thing you can do. You can also alter this with the URL. So you can put render equals true or render equals false. Don't quote me on this. You might have to check this because I always forget. I think render equals true always forces the local client to render it. Render equals false makes the server render it. And this is done just like I showed earlier with the record performance equals yes. This would just be render equals true at the end of that URL. Okay. So let's move forward. Some other useful information that I would share with you. There's a few things that I grabbed just because I think they're things that are very good for everybody to know. This is the order of operations. You may have seen this before. This is the order of operations of Tableau. What happens when you open a sheet, for example? And this is the order of how it happens. So the very first thing, the extract filters are applied. It's going to filter down your extract. The second thing, it's going to filter in your data source. The third is context filter. So if you want to add a filter to context, that's going to be the next thing. You have sets conditional top in, dimensional filters. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but this is very good information to know, just because it comes into play. The more that you use Tableau, the more you're going to have to think about what is that order, how are things applied, how are things trimmed out of the data, and sometimes things are going to impact your performance a little bit more than others. The next two things I stole from a presentation for designing efficient workbooks from Tableau Conference 18. This is essentially at a very, very high level what happens when you request a visualization. So when you open a viz on the browser, first it's going to request the viz. Tableau's going to load the viz. Tableau's going to then look back to the data. It's going to take the data and pull that back into the viz. It's going to compute the model, send that all back to Tableau and render the viz. Alternatively, there's some more work happening right here in the server side rendering, but it's useful to think about because there's a lot of things. And again, this is very high level. Every one of these arrows and boxes has probably 100 to 200 little steps that happen in them. And so every time you click a dashboard, you don't really think about it too much. You think, all right, I'm opening a viz. I'm getting that dashboard open for me, but there's a lot happening. It's got to think about it. Tableau's got to load it. It's got to get the data. It's got to compile the data back. It's got to turn it into a bunch of images. Those images need to be rendered together, and then it's going to show it, on the browser. So it's just useful information to think about. And then finally, a little bit on caching. Same presentation I took this from. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in here because there are so many ways Tableau can cache, but caching is also a very important thing when it comes to performance. You want to try and cache as much as you can. Some of these come to server-side settings that we got to make sure are applied. It depends on lots of things. How you've built this. Is there user filtering? Is there today references or now references in your calculations? There's a lot of things that we want to, you want to build them so that it's shareable across everything and all different times and different people. Notable resources. Designing efficient workbooks white paper. This is always the first thing. If somebody really wants to learn about performance and getting better with this is the first thing I'm always going to recommend. This is something like 60 pages. So you're probably going to want to get, something to drink while you're reading this. It's going to take a while, but it is the guide when it comes to performance. It goes into everything. calculation types, should you blend, how should you tune your server, what tools should you use for performance. If you want to take this presentation and go, 5 steps deeper, this is the thing that I would recommend to you. So just do a search on Tableau. You'll find this page. It's very useful to read through. Now, again, 60 pages, probably don't get this to your users, but for you guys that are interested in this topic, definitely something to think about. I will also say real quick that it's created by Interworks, one of the premier partners of Tableau, as is the second thing. So Interworks is very, very good company when it comes to different tools for performance and generally just across Tableau. This is another useful thing. So this is the performance optimization flowchart from Interworks. This essentially just goes through a lot of, okay, have you checked this? All right, then if you check this, go to this step. All right, have you checked this? Then go to this step. There's a lot of good information in here about, what you should look at. And it's broken out by like, all right, let's look at server and data sources. Let's look at calculations. It depends on what you're looking at. There's a lot of good information here. And it looks like Sagar has put the Designing Efficient Workbooks document out there. So definitely check that out. And then finally, there's some good Tableau conference videos here. These two come to mind as two things that I would recommend you take a look at. Designing Efficient Workbooks and Best Practices for Dashboard Design. They're both about an hour. Really good materials for you to check out, watch, give them a listen. Obviously, they're a little dated now, but still most of these things do apply very well. A brief recap. So the 6 things that I would kind of focus on as your high level things. First, you want to find your baseline. Depending on your use case and what you're working on and your audience and how you're building, 20 seconds might be okay. Maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10, maybe it's somewhere between. Focus on that. Analyze your performance. Use those tools that we mentioned, like desktop performance recording, server performance recording, the Postgres repository to learn more and to analyze what's happening. Trim your data. That's always the very first thing. Can you take out columns and rows and aggregate? Take out calculations, simplify things, trim things down as much as possible. Go through that performance list. It could be that flow chart, it could be the page that I mentioned, and find all of those don't do things and see if there's an opportunity to not have them in there. Look at those resources I mentioned. So read the white paper, go through the process flow, check out the videos, and there's so much more. There's blogs, there's so many other things about this kind of stuff. And iterate. It's gonna, it's never gonna be done in one thing. There's no silver bullet. There's no one thing that's always gonna fix things. It's gonna take going through that process several times to get to a point where you have good performance. Now, before I wrap and open up for questions, I do want to just shout out one thing. So just earlier this week, I announced a new Tableau Coders initiative. So this is something you can find at usergroups.tableau.com, Tableau Coders. This is a bi-weekly series that we're starting, myself and another member of the coding community, which is basically teaching you how to code and how to code with the Tableau API. So you're going to learn both things at the same time. So each week, each of the sessions will go a little bit deeper. So starting next Wednesday at 8 a.m. Eastern, so that'd be just about right now. Next Wednesday, we'll start off with how to get your environment set up. We'll continue to go forward. You'll learn more and more, like how to use the JavaScript API, how to embed, how to use the metadata API, how to set up your environment for server usage and things like that. So I would encourage you, if it's something you're interested in, to check it out, subscribe, and start attending those sessions. So that said, I'm open to questions now. So I think we've got just about 15 minutes for any sort of questions that you guys have.
Hey, Zach, thanks a lot for sharing all the tips and tricks and resources on performance. So I think this is one topic I have not seen the flow of questions, right? I think the chart is all filled with questions itself. So let me just start.
Yeah, and I think I actually have answered all the questions so far in the chat. There is one other question.
Okay.
One other question that's in there. Any prerequisites for the Tableau Coders Initiative? That's kind of the point, is no. So You don't have to know any sort of code. You don't need to know anything about any of the stuff. We're going to start from the, the, the floor. There's not going to be any expected knowledge when you join those sessions.
So Zach, Chetan is asking in execute query performance recording display query in XML format, how to interpret that in order to improve performance.
Yeah, it's not, I'll be honest, it's not the easiest thing to take this and really turn this into a lot of useful information. It's kind of been on my list that I'd like to take a stab at building a alternate version of this that you could use. Um, it's really just going through and finding, the different stuff. If I think I heard it's parsing XML is the big thing. So parsing XML, what happens in there is that is turning the file itself, which Tableau is just XML, like I said, that excuse me, that is taking that file and turning it into what you see in Tableau. It's taking all that code and saying, all right, this is a chart, this is a filter. So if you're spending a ton of time in parsing XML, what that usually tells me is your file is very big. There's a lot going on. It's maybe, there's tens of thousands of records of XML that it's got to turn into what you see in the workbook. So what I would probably suggest in there is there an opportunity to split it up, slice it out, kind of like I had mentioned?
Thank you, Zach. Tarun is asking how number of sheets and dashboards impact the performance of a book.
Yeah, that one I think I did go through. So you definitely want to,
Okay.
like I had said, trim it down, look for opportunities that you can split things up and have, kind of like a wrapper page to filter between the different workbooks. That's always a good thing. Could you please provide the Postgres data workbook you built and showed? So unfortunately, I can't actually give out the workbook itself. It's something something I use personally for work and stuff. I can show it on the screen at least a little bit again. Um, it's been on my list again for this is another thing to build out some more custom workbooks that you can use. So at some point down the road, hopefully, there will be more things out there that you can use. So yeah.
There is a question, Zach. I see multiple queries for performance recording. Are these queries executing in parallel?
Yeah, so it depends on a couple things. What you're connecting to, is it live? Is it extract? Can Tableau parallelize those queries? So Tableau does have parallelization. Gosh, that's always a hard word to say, but it does have that. It built in something like Tableau 9.0. So what Tableau tries to do is it looks for commonality between queries that it needs to send, and it actually tries to group those together if it can. The way that you can really see that inside of like this workbook is this truly is what's happening at what point in the process. So these things, for example, this executing query and this executing query are happening at the same time. So Tableau is going to do its best to do it, and you'll want to look at this chart to see like what is happening at the same time as well. And yeah, so thanks, Sagar. You got datatheories.com. I will be honest, there's only one post there from last year. I'm not the best at doing that. You should also follow me on Twitter. Twitter's where I'm most active at Zak's Viz. Just if you do want to always see like the latest things that I publish, promote, sessions I record, things like this.
And Jack, what's your feedback about context filters? So Viraj is asking, do context filters impact the performance too?
So so there's the old way of thinking, the newer way of thinking. So the old way of thinking was there was context filters. They were always this terrible beast that always slowed things down. They have gotten better, but they've also gotten less needed as how the time has went on. So there's a lot of other ways to do things, with LODs and other ways of filtering the data. Context filters, still what I would say is use them sparingly. Um, Maybe try not to do them in live connections so much. And also, there's a piece in one of those videos that I mentioned that actually goes through this in a little bit more detail. But the thinking has changed. If you're looking at how it used to be 5 years ago, where it was just like never use context filters, they're gonna kill your performance. It's definitely not anywhere near that bad anymore.
So there is a question, Zach, from Mani Kandan, and he's asking, in geocoding, as per your example, it takes 4 seconds. If you want to improve the performance here, what are all the things we need to do?
Yeah, it's honestly just one of those things that you're by default gonna get a little bit of an increase in performance. Um, so maps take a little bit more time. There is the map engine that has to take place. Something that you could do is use local maps that reduces traffic, makes it so that it's local to Tableau, to the dashboard itself. Um, but it reduces the flexibility. You can't get super custom with the map. So there's not too much more outside of that. Simplifying your marks. Try not to do a bunch of layers if you're using map layers. But you're always going to get that couple second there that it's default by using maps. Just by its nature, geographic things, map things are just a touch slower than other things.
Zach Jeffrey is asking, what is your advice about using filters to apply to or to sheets that are on multiple dashboards within the same workbook?
Yeah, I'm not too worried about. So if you use the all using this data source or whatever, it's escaping me right now. So if you do a filter here, going on right here, that's not. Oh, that's why I'm on the wrong tab. Um, if you are on a sheet and you use a filter, um, all using this data source is not too bad. You still want to use it sparingly because it's just like anything. An example of it's more honestly the way that I think about this is the higher you go, the slower it will be. So only this worksheet is very simple. It's giving me this worksheet. Selected worksheets is only going to be a few or a handful of them, and all using this data source is probably the top of where I'd ever go. All using this data source is okay. It is going to be a little bit slower because it got to, translate it across all those sheets, but it's still not anywhere near as bad as all using related data sources because that imposes a blend and that takes a lot of time. So, as long as you don't have like 10 filters and all of them are all using this data source, it shouldn't be that big of a deal.
Zach, there is an interesting question. Will hiding filters in a container help improving performance using the show and hide feature?
No, so Tableau still has to think about those things. It still renders those things. I'll be honest, I haven't done a lot of like performance testing on that specifically, but my understanding is Tableau still in the background is rendering all those and their values. I don't think it like pushes the load of those filters to when you show the filter. I'm 95% sure that, not 100%. Um, I've seen honestly in cases where dashboards are really slow that throwing them in that show hide container actually just slows things down a little bit just because it takes a long time to get the show to show and then go to the filter and then hide it again. As far as a design perspective, I think it's a very good option to hide things like that. But it can maybe make it slightly slower, but not probably shouldn't be noticeable in most cases.
Thank you, Zach. I'm just seeing if you have not answered any question. Zach, there is one question around second, how to improve loading performance. Uh, Mukhtar, do you want to, I think, elaborate a lot on what exactly you mean by loading performance?
It might be. So I see Mukta put a question
Loading the
above
dashboard?
that. Well, it looks like Mukta might have had a question above that. Okay, so I don't know if these all relate or not. Loading performance navigation. Um, yeah, I'm still not completely sure. I'll answer the one above that, and if you want to elaborate on the improving loading performance navigation. So if a context filter is used and if there are other dependent filters use option only relevant values, then will the context filter help in this case? It could. So, a context filter is going to basically reduce it to a sample population of the full data set. So a context filter, let's say we're looking at, I don't know, we've got our categories, we've got the big three, we've got office supplies, technology, and furniture. So I filtered the furniture. The other filters are only ever going to look at furniture. So it should in touch, in effect, make it a little bit faster. Now the context filter itself, that might slow things down. So you might be going where you're like losing a little bit of time from that, speeding up the other filter. So it's a balancing game. Like I've said before, like a lot of these things are touch and go. A lot of these things are dependent. A lot of these things are variable. So, it's one of those things. That's why it's so good to have these performance testing things. So you can try once, do with the performance recording, change it, try it again with the performance recording, and see if that actually, impacts, if it makes it faster, if it makes it slower.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Zach, for that. Any last question for Zach before we go ahead and close the session? Zach, I have just one question for you. If someone is new to Tableau, right, and if they have just started using this product, what will be your advice to them, right, in terms of how they should go ahead and learn the foundational knowledge of the product, and then also think about performance beforehand when they are applying it back to their use cases?
Yeah, so as far as how to get started, where to go, I don't think that there's a better thing than just the data community itself. Going through and just seeing what's out there. If you just look at data fam as like a hashtag on Twitter and LinkedIn, you're gonna find dozens and dozens of people that are just like always constantly posting things. And it's going to be about performance. It's going to be about best practices. It's going to be about design. It's about this cool thing they found out you could do in Tableau. And it's also a very open and welcoming community. So definitely reach out to people if you ever have questions, myself included. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. As in, even just including VizConnect, like there's so many sessions. Sagar, you've done a, phenomenal job of like having such a huge variety of different things and content. So looking at the YouTube channel and finding all those videos and finding the things that interest you, it's the long game. You're not going to learn everything overnight, but incrementally going through and learning new things, watching these videos, checking in with people, reading blogs, it's all helpful. The second question about performance. I often find that people think about performance after they've built the dashboard. And it's always good to think about that upfront and during the process. So think about the impact of things as you're building them. Think about doing performance reporting along the way. Think about checking with your users and seeing how the performance is going. Think about how the server is going to handle things. There's a lot of things that you should think about during and before the process, as opposed to coming back reactively and saying, "Oh crap, this is just too slow. I can't release this." Or it's already released and it's too slow. It just puts you in kind of a predicament that it's more difficult to handle.
Thank you, Zach, for that. Just one last question from Ben. How do you start the conversation with the stakeholders that some of their functionality requests need to be compromised if they're asking for more performance?
That's a great question. Um, it's it the thing that I always suggest is just being as honest as possible and trying to back it up with data. So maybe you try what they're doing and you show, here's a performance recording. I've looked at this. I've seen what this is going to do. Um, this is what it looks like without your thing. This is what it looks like with it. You're going to lose, 5 seconds of performance. It's going to get this much slower. Is it really worth that? Is it worth the trade-off? Being 5 seconds faster, 2 seconds faster. I think a lot of cases, no matter who they are and what they want, performance is always going to be really critical to almost any stakeholder. So I think being honest is always important in those cases.
Perfect. I think with that, thanks a lot, Zach. It was an honor to have you on VizConnect, and thank you for sharing all the best practices on performance and how we can go ahead and get better at it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. With that, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining the session. Take care, be safe, and we'll see you next week.